My parents invited us to dinner. Dad pulled out a paper and read it. I'd been removed from the will for marrying her. Everyone at the table already knew. My wife grabbed my hand. I didn't say a word. We just left. 8 months later, Mom showed up at my door crying. My name's James, I'm 34, and about 8 months ago my father sat me down at a dinner table in front of my entire family and told me I'd been erased. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, though that was certainly part of it. I mean, he literally pulled a folded piece of paper out of his breast pocket, smoothed it out like he was about to read a toast at a wedding, and informed me that I had been removed from the family will. The reason? I married the wrong woman. At least, wrong according to him. According to me, she's the best decision I ever made. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I grew up in a small suburb outside of Richmond, Virginia. Nice enough place. The kind of town where everybody knows your last name and your parents' last name, and probably your grandfather's last name too. My dad, Gerald, was a retired financial planner who treated his own family like a portfolio he needed to manage. My mom, Lorraine, was the kind of woman who kept the peace so aggressively that she'd set the whole house on fire just to avoid an argument. I have an older sister, Paige, who's 3 years ahead of me, and a younger brother, Colton, who came along 5 years after I did. Growing up, the three of us were close in the way siblings are when they share a roof, but not necessarily a wavelength. Paige was the overachiever. Colton was the baby. And I was the middle kid who was good at enough things to avoid attention, but not great enough at any one thing to earn praise. My dad had a very specific idea of what success looked like. It looked like him. Financial career, a house that impressed the neighbors, a wife who hosted dinner parties and never raised her voice. He wanted all three of his kids to follow that blueprint. And to his credit, Paige came pretty close. She married a guy named Trent who works in commercial real estate. They bought a house 2 streets over from my parents. And every Sunday they all had brunch together like a Norman Rockwell painting that nobody asked for. Colton was still figuring things out, which my dad tolerated because Colton was the youngest and could do no wrong. That left me, the middle child, who had committed the unforgivable sin of becoming a high school history teacher and being completely fine with it. My dad never said he was disappointed in my career, but he didn't have to. Every Thanksgiving it was the same thing. Trent would talk about some commercial property he closed on, and my dad would nod like he was watching a sunset. Then someone would ask me how school was going, and my dad would say something like, "Well, at least the benefits are decent." That was his version of encouragement. I learned to let it roll off me because honestly, I loved my job. I coached the junior varsity baseball team. I ran a history trivia club that the kids actually showed up to voluntarily, and I went home every day feeling like I'd done something that mattered. My dad could keep his spreadsheets. Then I met Naomi. Naomi walked into my life at a friend's backyard barbecue 3 years ago. She was there with a mutual friend, standing by the cooler, laughing at something on her phone. She had this energy about her that I can only describe as effortlessly magnetic. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention. She just was. We started talking about, of all things, a documentary about the Roman Empire, and 2 hours later we were still standing by that cooler and everyone else had moved inside. By the end of the night, I had her number and a feeling in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Naomi is biracial. Her mom is black, her dad is white, and she grew up in Baltimore. She's a pediatric occupational therapist who works with kids on the autism spectrum. She is, without exaggeration, the kindest and most grounded person I have ever met. She's also funny as hell and will absolutely destroy you in Scrabble without breaking a sweat. I fell hard and I fell fast. And within 6 months I knew I was going to marry her. Here's where things started getting complicated. The first time I brought Naomi home to meet my parents, my dad was polite. Stiff, but polite. He shook her hand, asked her a couple of surface-level questions about her job, and then spent the rest of the evening talking to Trent about interest rates. My mom tried harder. She complimented Naomi's dress, asked about her family, and made a real effort to include her in conversation. But there was something behind her eyes that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't hostility. It was more like discomfort, like she was trying to solve a math problem she hadn't studied for. After that first visit, my dad pulled me aside in the garage and said, "She seems nice enough, but are you sure she's the right fit for this family?" I asked him what he meant by that, and he gave me this look, this practiced look of plausible deniability, and said, "I just mean culturally. You two come from very different backgrounds. I told him that Naomi and I had plenty in common and that I didn't appreciate the implication. He held up his hands and said, "I'm not implying anything. I'm just looking out for you." That was the first red flag. I should have paid more attention to it. Instead, I chalked it up to my dad being his usual awkward, controlling self and moved on. Over the next year and a half, things progressed with Naomi and things regressed with my family. Every time I brought her to a family event, the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Paige was civil but distant. Trent barely acknowledged Naomi at all. Colton was the only one who seemed genuinely cool with her, but Colton was 23 and living in his own world half the time, so his support, while appreciated, didn't carry much weight in the family hierarchy. My dad kept making comments that were technically deniable but emotionally unmistakable. He'd reference how different our upbringings were. He'd ask if Naomi's family was comfortable around us, as if she were a foreign exchange student and not a woman with a master's degree who paid her own mortgage. I proposed to Naomi on a Tuesday night in our apartment because she once told me she thought public proposals were stressful and she'd rather it be just us. So I cooked her favorite meal, put the ring in a small wooden box on the table, and asked her to marry me while we were both still in our work clothes. She said yes before I even finished the question. It was the happiest moment of my life. When I told my parents, my mom said congratulations in a voice that sounded like she was reading a cue card. My dad said, "Well, I hope you know what you're doing." Paige sent a text that just said, "Wow, congrats." No exclamation point. No emoji. Just 5 letters and a period. I told Naomi not to worry about it. I told her my family would come around. I believed it at the time. I was wrong. We got married 4 months later at a small venue outside of Charlottesville. It was beautiful. Naomi's family showed up in full force, laughing and dancing and hugging me like I'd been part of their family my whole life. My side was thinner. My mom came. Paige came, but left early. Trent didn't come at all, citing a work conflict that I'm fairly certain was fictional. Colton was there and gave a surprisingly heartfelt toast. My dad came, sat in the back row, and left during the reception without saying goodbye. I watched him walk to his car from the window of the venue, and something in my chest cracked a little. But Naomi squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're not losing anything that was really yours." And she was right. I just didn't know yet how right she was. 3 months after the wedding, my mom called and invited us to a family dinner. She said it was long overdue and that everyone wanted to celebrate our marriage properly. I was cautiously optimistic. Naomi was cautiously skeptical. She put on a nice dress anyway and brought a bottle of wine because that's who she is. We drove to my parents' house with the windows down and the radio on. And for about 20 minutes, I let myself believe that maybe things were finally going to be okay. We pulled into the driveway, and I saw every car. Paige's SUV, Trent's truck, Colton's beat-up sedan. The whole family was there. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. We walked in, and the house smelled like pot roast and something sweet, maybe a cobbler. My mom greeted us at the door with a hug that lasted a beat too long. The kind of hug that felt more like an apology in advance than a welcome. She took the wine from Naomi and said, "Oh, you didn't have to do that, sweetheart," in a tone that was warm on the surface but hollow underneath. The dining room table was set with the good china, the stuff my mom only brought out for Thanksgiving and Easter. That was the second thing that felt off. This was supposed to be a casual family dinner, but the table looked like it was staged for a magazine shoot. Everyone was already seated when we walked in. Paige gave a thin-lipped smile and said, "Hey, you too." Trent nodded without looking up from his phone. Colton waved from the end of the table and said, "What's up, brother?" My dad was at the head of the table, sitting straight-backed with his hands folded in front of him like a judge about to deliver a verdict. He looked at me and said, "Glad you could make it." He did not look at Naomi, not even a glance. We sat down and my mom started serving the food. Conversation was light at first. Paige talked about remodeling their guest bathroom. Colton talked about a camping trip he was planning. I told a story about one of my students accidentally calling me dad in class, which got a genuine laugh from Colton and a polite chuckle from my mom. Naomi complimented the pot roast, and my mom said thank you in a voice so quiet it barely registered. The whole thing felt like everyone was reading from a script, and the real scene hadn't started yet. About 20 minutes into dinner, my dad cleared his throat. Not a normal throat clearing. This was the kind of deliberate, performative throat clearing that a man does when he wants the room to go silent. And it worked. Everyone stopped talking. Forks went down. Eyes went to him. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, which I only now realized he was wearing to a family dinner in his own house, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, smoothed it against the table with both palms, and adjusted his reading glasses. "James," he said, "your mother and I have been doing some estate planning recently. We've updated our will and our trust, and we felt it was important to be transparent with the family about the changes." My heart started beating faster, but I didn't know why yet. I just sat there, holding my fork like an idiot, waiting for whatever was coming. He looked down at the paper and began reading. "The house," he said, "would go to Paige and Trent. The vacation cabin in the Shenandoah Valley would go to Colton. The investment accounts would be split between Paige and Colton. The life insurance payout would be split between Paige and Colton." He read every single line item like he was presenting quarterly earnings to a board of directors. And not once did he say my name. Not once. When he finished reading, he folded the paper back up, placed it on the table beside his plate, and looked at me. We felt this was the fairest arrangement given the circumstances. I sat there in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 seconds. The room was dead quiet. Nobody was eating. Nobody was moving. And then I looked around the table, and that's when it hit me. Nobody was surprised. Paige was staring at her plate like she was trying to will herself invisible. Trent was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking almost bored. Colton was fidgeting with his napkin, his jaw tight, avoiding my eyes. My mom had her hands in her lap and her gaze fixed somewhere near the centerpiece, blinking rapidly. They all knew. Every single one of them knew before I walked through that door. This wasn't a dinner. It was a sentencing. "What circumstances?" I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. My dad took off his glasses and set them on the table. "James, you made a choice that we don't feel aligns with the values and direction of this family. We've made our feelings known, and you chose to move forward regardless. We respect your right to make that decision, but we also have the right to make ours." "A choice," I repeated. "You mean my wife?" He didn't flinch. "I mean the path you've chosen." I looked at my mother. "Mom, you agreed to this." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, "Your father and I discussed it. It's what we felt was best for everyone. You cut your own son out of the will, and you think that's best for everyone." I said, "Nobody's cutting you out of anything," my dad said, and his voice had that edge to it, that controlled anger he always used when he felt like someone was challenging his authority. "You're still part of this family. This is about assets, about legacy, about making sure the family's resources go where they'll be properly managed." "Properly managed," I said, and I could feel my hands starting to shake under the table. "What does that mean, Dad? Say what you actually mean for once in your life." He stared at me. The room held its breath. And then he said, "It means I don't believe your current household reflects the values we've built this family on. And I'm not going to fund a direction I don't support." There it was. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Everyone at that table knew exactly what he meant, and nobody said a word to challenge it. I turned to Paige. "You knew about this?" Paige looked up, and her face was red. "James, I didn't. I mean, Dad told us last week. I didn't think it was my place to." "Your place to what? Warn me? Tell me I was walking into an ambush." "It's not an ambush," my dad said. "It's a family conversation." "No," I said. "A family conversation is when you talk to someone. This is a performance. You invited us here so you could humiliate me in front of everyone and make sure I knew exactly where I stood." The table went silent again. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear Naomi breathing next to me, slow and steady, like she was holding herself together with pure willpower. I looked at her. Her face was composed, but her eyes were glassy. She wasn't going to cry in front of these people. I knew that about her. She would hold it together until we were alone, and then she would let herself feel it. And I loved her for that. And I hated my family for putting her in a position where she had to. Naomi reached over and took my hand under the table. She didn't say anything. She just held on. And in that grip, I felt something shift inside me. The anger didn't go away, but it got quiet. It stopped buzzing, and it started sharpening. I looked at my dad. I looked at my mom. I looked at Paige and Trent and Colton. Every face at that table. And I made a decision. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and said, "Thank you for dinner." That was it. For words. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the fight he was clearly prepared for. Naomi stood up beside me, and we walked out of that dining room, through the hallway, past the family photos on the wall that apparently didn't include me anymore, and out the front door. We got in the car. I put the key in the ignition and just sat there. Naomi didn't say a word. She just kept holding my hand. After about 2 minutes, she said, "You okay?" I shook my head. "No." "Okay," she said. "Then let's go home." The whole ride was silent. When we pulled into our apartment complex, I turned off the car and sat there. Then I said, "He planned that. He rehearsed it. He wore a blazer to his own dining room, so he could pull a piece of paper out of his pocket like some kind of courtroom lawyer." Naomi nodded. "I know. And nobody told me." "I know. I'm done," I said. "I'm done trying to earn their approval." Naomi squeezed my hand one more time and said, "Whatever you need, I'm here." We went inside. Naomi made tea and sat next to me on the couch without saying a word. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer platitudes. She just existed next to me while I processed the fact that my own father had just disowned me with a PowerPoint presentation at a pot roast dinner. If it weren't so devastating, it would almost be funny. Almost. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying every moment. The folded paper. The blazer. The way my dad said current household, like Naomi was a stock he didn't want in his portfolio. He didn't just cut me out of his will. He invited me to dinner to watch him do it. He wanted Naomi to sit there and feel it. That wasn't estate planning. That was cruelty dressed up in a blazer and a folded piece of paper. The next morning, something was different. The sadness was still there, sitting in my chest like a stone. But underneath it was something harder. Something that whispered, "They think you need them. Prove them wrong." The first week after that dinner was the hardest. I went to work every day, stood in front of my students, taught them about the Civil War and the New Deal and the fall of Rome, and pretended that my own family hadn't just crumbled. I smiled when the kids made jokes. I gave feedback on essays. I ran baseball practice and called out batting orders like nothing was wrong. But every night I came home and sat on the couch and felt the weight of it settle back onto my chest like a wet blanket I couldn't shake off. Naomi watched me carefully during that first week. She didn't push. She didn't pry. She just made sure there was food on the table and the apartment didn't fall apart while I was quietly falling apart inside. On the fourth night, she sat down next to me and said, "You're allowed to be angry, James. You don't have to be strong for me right now." "I'm not being strong," I said. "I'm being numb. There's a difference." She nodded. "I know, but numb has an expiration date. When it wears off, I'm going to be right here." She was right. On day 6, the numbness cracked open and everything came flooding in. I was sitting in my car after practice, watching the last few kids get picked up by their parents, and I just lost it. I gripped the steering wheel and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a kid. Not just about the will. About all of it. About every Thanksgiving where my dad looked through me. About every family dinner where I felt like a guest in my own house. About the fact that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had conditions after all, and those conditions were apparently about who I chose to build my life with. I sat in that car for 20 minutes. When I was done, I wiped my face, drove home, and walked through the door looking like I'd been caught in a rainstorm. Naomi took one look at me, wrapped her arms around me, and said, "There he is. Now we can start." And she was right about that too. The first thing I did was stop waiting for someone from my family to reach out. In the 2 weeks since the dinner, I'd received exactly 0 calls, 0 texts, and 0 smoke signals from anyone with my last name. Paige sent nothing. Colton sent one text that said, "Hey man, I'm sorry about what happened," and then went radio silent when I asked if he'd known in advance. My mom sent a text that said, "I love you, James," with no follow-up, no acknowledgement of what had happened, no offer to talk. Just 3 words floating in the void like a participation trophy for the worst night of my life. My dad sent nothing. Of course he didn't. He'd said what he wanted to say. The blazer was back in the closet, and the paper was back in the drawer, and as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. So I closed it too. I didn't block anyone. I didn't send a dramatic goodbye message. I just stopped reaching out. Stopped calling. Stopped showing up. If they wanted me gone, I'd be gone. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I was going to disappear loudly, by living so well that the silence from my end would be deafening. Naomi and I had been talking for a while about buying a house. We'd been saving slowly and carefully because teachers and pediatric therapists aren't exactly rolling in investment capital. But we'd been disciplined. We had a solid emergency fund and a down payment that was almost where it needed to be. The week after the dinner, Naomi came home and told me that a colleague of hers was leaving her practice and there was an opening for a senior therapist position. Better pay, more autonomy, and the chance to build out a new program for early intervention. She applied. 2 weeks later, she got it. The pay bump was significant enough that our timeline for buying a house moved up by about 6 months. Meanwhile, I'd been doing some math of my own. The varsity head coach, a guy named Sullivan who'd been there for 19 years, announced he was retiring at the end of the school year. The position came with a stipend, a better office, and actual resources. I applied, interviewed, and got it. The athletic director, a no-nonsense woman named Rosalind, told me I was her first choice because the kids respected me and I actually showed up to every practice, which apparently was a higher bar than most people cleared. Small wins. That's what those first 2 months were about. Small wins stacking up like bricks. Each one a little piece of the life Naomi and I were building together. We found a house in April, a 3-bedroom Cape Cod with a big backyard and a front porch that was begging for rocking chairs. It needed some work, but it was ours. The day we closed on it, Naomi and I sat on the bare living room floor with takeout containers between us, and she said, "Your dad wanted to control what you inherited. Look at what you built instead." I kissed her on the forehead and said, "I married way out of my league." She said, "Obviously," and stole my last egg roll. Around the same time, something unexpected happened. One of my former students, a kid named Emmett who'd graduated 2 years earlier, reached out and told me he'd started a podcast about overlooked moments in history and that my trivia club was what inspired him. He asked if I'd come on as a guest. I said sure, figured maybe 12 people would hear it. The episode got picked up by a history education blog, then a teacher resource site, and within a month I had 3 other podcasts asking me to come on. Teachers from across the state were reaching out, asking for tips, sharing their own stories. I wasn't famous. I wasn't making money from it. But I was being recognized for something I cared about, and that felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. Naomi's new position was thriving too. She'd built out the early intervention program from scratch, hired 2 new therapists, and was getting referrals from pediatricians across the region. She was working longer hours but coming home energized, talking about breakthroughs with her kids, planning workshops, collaborating with schools. Watching her light up about her work was one of my favorite things. She had this way of describing her patients that made you feel like every single one of them was the most important kid in the world. Because to her, they were. We settled into the house, painted the walls, fixed the leaky faucet, planted a garden that Naomi swore she'd maintain and that I knew I'd end up weeding. We adopted a dog from the shelter, a goofy mutt named Roosevelt because I'm a history teacher and I couldn't help myself. We had friends over for cookouts and sat on the porch in the evenings. It was a quiet, normal, beautiful life. The kind of life my dad apparently thought I didn't deserve. During all of this, I heard nothing from my family. Paige didn't reach out when I posted about the new house. My mom didn't call about the coaching promotion. My dad was a wall of silence, which honestly was less painful than his presence had been. They made their choice. I made mine. But here's the thing about building a good life after someone tells you that you can't. It doesn't just heal you. It sharpens you. Every month that passed, every small victory, every night I spent laughing with Naomi on our porch with Roosevelt at our feet, I felt more solid, more sure, more like the person I was always supposed to be. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice said, "They're going to come back. They always do. And when they do, you're going to be ready." I didn't know how right that voice was. But about 6 months after the dinner, I got the first sign. Colton called me on a Thursday night, which was unusual because Colton communicated almost exclusively through text messages and memes. He sounded off. Not upset, exactly, but uneasy. He said, "Hey, I just wanted to check in. How's the house?" We talked for about 10 minutes. Casual stuff. He told me he'd gotten a new job at an outdoor recreation company and was thinking about going back to school for environmental science. I told him about the coaching position and the podcast appearances. And then, right before we hung up, he said something that stuck with me. "James, things at home are different. Dad's been, I don't know, quiet. Mom cries a lot. Paige and Trent are having problems. It's like the whole house shifted when you left. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That's not my problem to fix, Colton." "I know," he said. "I'm just telling you." "I appreciate that," I said. "But they made their choice. And I've made mine." We hung up. I sat on the porch for a while after that, listening to the crickets and scratching Roosevelt behind his ears. Something was shifting. I could feel it. The family that had pushed me out was starting to feel the shape of the hole I left. And for the first time, I didn't feel sad about it. I felt ready. 2 weeks after Colton's phone call, something happened that I didn't see coming. I was at school, sitting in my office after practice, going through game film for an upcoming matchup when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Paige, the first one in over 6 months. It said, "Hey James, can we talk? Just you and me. No dad." I stared at that message for a good 5 minutes. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wanted to respond with something petty. But the part of me that Naomi had helped rebuild, the part that was grounded and strategic instead of reactive, told me to hear her out. So I replied, "Sure. Coffee on Saturday." We met at a cafe halfway between our houses. Paige was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug like she was trying to absorb warmth from it, even though it was 75 degrees outside. She looked different, thinner, tired. The polished, put-together version of my sister that usually showed up to family events was gone, and in her place was someone who looked like she hadn't slept well in months. "Hey," she said when I sat down. "Hey." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I owe you an apology. A real one. Not a text message, not a phone call. Face to face." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I knew what Dad was going to do at that dinner," she said. "He told me and Trent a week before. He said he was restructuring the estate and that he'd be making an announcement. He called it a family meeting. He didn't use the word disown, but the intent was obvious. And I didn't warn you. I didn't say anything. I sat there and watched it happen, and I've been sick about it ever since." "Then why didn't you warn me?" I asked, not with anger, just a genuine question. Paige looked down at her coffee. "Because I was afraid. Dad has this grip on our family, James. He controls things. Money, property, approval. He's been holding that wool over our heads since we were teenagers. When he told me about the changes, my first instinct was to protect my own position. And I hate myself for that. But it's the truth." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I appreciate you being honest." "There's more," she said. She told me that since the dinner, things in the family had deteriorated significantly. My dad, who had always been controlling but functional, had become increasingly isolated. He'd picked a fight with Trent over some investment advice, and the two of them were barely speaking. Paige and Trent's marriage was strained, partly because of the family tension and partly because Trent had been dismissive of her feelings about what happened to me. She told me that Trent's response when she expressed guilt about the dinner was, "Your dad's money, your dad's rules." She said that was the moment she realized Trent might not be the partner she thought he was. And then there was my mom. Paige said Lorraine had been a mess, crying regularly, going to church more often, talking about me in conversations where I wasn't the subject. Paige said she'd overheard my mom say to a friend on the phone, "I lost my son over a piece of paper." But she still hadn't picked up the phone to call me directly, at least not in any meaningful way. That one text, "I love you, James," was all she'd managed. Paige said she thought our mom was paralyzed by guilt and fear of my dad's reaction if she reached out behind his back. "She's scared of him?" I asked. Paige shook her head. "Not scared of him physically, scared of the consequences. If she goes against him on this, she's afraid he'll turn on her too. You know how he is. If you're not with him, you're against him." I knew exactly how he was. I'd lived under that roof for 18 years. Paige and I talked for almost 2 hours. She told me she wanted to rebuild our relationship, that she missed me, and that she understood if I needed time or space or both. I told her I appreciated her coming to me and that I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine, but I also wasn't going to punish her for being honest now. We agreed to stay in touch, not performatively, not out of obligation, but genuinely. When we left the cafe, she hugged me and said, "Naomi is wonderful." I should have said that a long time ago. "Yeah," I said. "You should have." When I got home, I told Naomi everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something she does that I will never stop being grateful for. When I finished, she said, "How do you feel about it?" "Cautiously hopeful," I said, "but also like I'm watching chess pieces move and I need to be careful about which ones I trust." Good instinct, she said. What do you want to do? Nothing right now, I said. I want to let them come to me. All of them. I'm not chasing approval anymore. If they want to be in my life, they need to show up properly. Not with a text. Not with a coffee meeting. They need to look at Naomi and see what I see, and they need to say it out loud. Naomi smiled at me. Since when did you get so strategic? I married a therapist, I said. Some of it rubbed off. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something interesting. The podcast appearances I'd been doing had started gaining real traction. A state education association reached out and asked me to speak at their annual conference about innovative approaches to teaching history. The conference was in Richmond, which meant it was about 20 minutes from my parents' house. The organizer, a woman named Waverly, told me they'd seen my podcast episodes and thought I'd be a perfect keynote for their Saturday morning session. Keynote. Me. The middle kid who picked a career his dad considered barely a step above volunteering. I said yes immediately, and then I did something I probably shouldn't admit to. I checked the conference website and saw that it would be covered by the local news because the governor's office was co-sponsoring it as part of an education initiative. There would be press. There would be photos. There would be a public record of James, the disappointment, standing on a stage in his hometown being celebrated for the exact career his father had dismissed. I'm not going to pretend I didn't enjoy that thought. I'm human. Meanwhile, Naomi had news of her own. She'd been approached by the director of the Children's Hospital Network about expanding her early intervention model to 3 additional sites across the state. They wanted to fund a pilot program, and they wanted Naomi to lead it. The salary was a significant step up, and more importantly, it would put her in a position to help hundreds more kids. She was electric about it. I watched her pace around the living room, outlining her plans, talking about staffing and training protocols and outcome metrics, and I thought, this is the woman my father thought wasn't good enough for his family. This woman who is about to change the landscape of pediatric therapy in Virginia. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. I called Colton and told him about the conference. He said he'd try to come. I told Paige, and she said she'd be there for sure. I did not tell my parents. I didn't need to. I knew the way small-town information traveled. Word would get back to them. It always did. The week before the conference, I sat on my porch with Roosevelt sleeping at my feet and Naomi reading beside me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not sadness, not even vindication, exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the deep, bone-level satisfaction of knowing that I had built something real, a career I was proud of, a home I loved, a marriage that was the strongest thing in my life. And none of it, not a single piece of it, came from my father's approval or his money or his folded piece of paper. He thought removing me from the will would bring me to heel. Instead, it set me free. The night before the conference, Naomi laid out my suit and said, "You're going to be incredible tomorrow." What if I'm not? I said, because even confident people get nervous sometimes. She looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, "James, you changed kids' lives in a classroom with a whiteboard and a budget of basically nothing. You're going to stand on a stage and tell that story, and people are going to feel it. Trust me." I trusted her. I always did. And for the first time, I fully trusted myself too. What I didn't know yet was that the conference wasn't going to be the big moment. It was going to be what happened after. Because while I was preparing to stand in front of a room full of educators and tell my story, my mother was preparing to stand on my front porch and tell hers. The conference was on a Saturday morning in mid-October. The venue was a hotel conference center in downtown Richmond, the kind of place with tall windows and too many chairs and the faint smell of industrial carpet cleaner. I stood backstage listening to the muffled buzz of a few hundred educators filing in, and my hands were shaking just enough that I had to put my coffee down. Naomi was in the front row. Colton had come, sitting near the back, looking slightly out of place among all the teachers but grinning when he caught my eye. Paige was there too, 3 rows behind Naomi, and she gave me a small wave that felt more genuine than anything she'd offered me in years. I walked on stage, adjusted the microphone, and for about 2 seconds I felt like I might pass out. Then I looked at Naomi, and she mouthed the words, "You've got this." And just like that, the nerves dissolved. I talked for 40 minutes. I talked about choosing teaching when everyone around me treated it like a consolation prize. I talked about the trivia club, about Emmett and his podcast, about watching kids who hated school walk into my classroom and find something that made them curious. I talked about how education isn't about passing tests. It's about giving a kid a reason to keep showing up. I didn't mention my dad by name. I didn't need to. When I finished, the room stood up. I think it's because I told the truth, and teachers don't hear enough of it. Naomi was on her feet before anyone else, clapping with tears rolling down her face. Colton was whistling like he was at a baseball game. Even Paige was standing, her hand pressed against her mouth. After the talk, people came up to shake my hand and tell me their own stories. A reporter from the local NBC affiliate asked for a quick interview. Waverly told me it was the best keynote they'd had in 5 years. Colton pulled me aside and said, "Dude, I had no idea you were that good at this." Paige hugged me and said, "Mom and Dad should have been here." I didn't respond to that. The local news segment aired that Monday evening. Naomi told me they used a clip of me saying something about how the best teachers remember what it felt like to be a kid who needed someone to believe in them. Apparently my mother saw it too, because 3 days later, she showed up at my door. It was a Thursday afternoon. Naomi was at work. I was in the kitchen making lunch and grading papers simultaneously, which is a skill they don't teach you in education school, but should. Roosevelt started barking at the front door, which usually meant a delivery driver or a particularly bold squirrel. I opened the door, and there was my mother, standing on my porch in a cardigan and flats, holding a small gift bag, with mascara streaked down both cheeks. "James," she said, and then she started crying. Not the quiet, dignified crying she'd done at the dinner. This was the messy, shoulders shaking, can't catch your breath kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep. I stood there for a moment. I'd imagined this scenario a dozen times over the past 8 months, and in every version I'd been cool and composed, and maybe a little cold. But looking at my mother falling apart on my front porch, all of that rehearsed detachment evaporated. I said, "Come in, Mom." She sat on my couch and cried for 5 minutes straight while Roosevelt sat at her feet looking concerned. I got her a glass of water and a box of tissues and sat in the chair across from her and waited. When she finally collected herself enough to speak, she said, "I saw the news. I saw you on that stage, and I realized that I missed everything. I missed your wedding. I missed your house. I missed you becoming this person, and it's because I was too much of a coward to stand up to your father." I let her talk. She told me that the night of the dinner, she'd wanted to stop my dad. She said she'd argued with him privately for 2 weeks before, begged him not to make it a public announcement, told him he was going to lose me. But she'd capitulated. She said she'd started seeing a therapist, her first time ever, and that the therapist helped her understand that her silence wasn't peacekeeping. It was enabling. I enabled him, she said. For 37 years, I let him control everything because I was afraid of the alternative. And the alternative was just standing up and saying this is wrong. That's all it would have taken. 2 words. And I couldn't do it. I let that sit. Then I said, "Mom, I appreciate you coming here. I really do. But I need you to understand something. What happened at that dinner wasn't just about a will. Dad made a calculated decision to humiliate me and my wife in front of the entire family because he doesn't approve of who she is. And you let it happen. Paige let it happen. Colton let it happen. Every single person at that table chose silence. That's not something I can forgive with a gift bag and an apology." She nodded, still crying. "I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking you to let me try. Let me earn it." "How?" I said. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I told your father last week that I'm not going along with this anymore. I told him that removing you from the will was the worst decision we've ever made and that I want it reversed. He refused. So I told him that if he doesn't reverse it, I'm filing for separation. I'll be honest, I did not see that coming. My mother, the woman who had spent her entire adult life deferring to my father, had drawn a line. I sat there for a moment, processing. "You told Dad you'd leave him?" "I did, and I meant it. I've already spoken with a lawyer. Your father thinks I'm bluffing. He's wrong." There was something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Steel, not anger, not bravado, just the quiet, immovable certainty of a woman who had finally decided that being comfortable was less important than being right. Naomi came home about an hour later to find my mother and me sitting on the porch with Roosevelt between us, drinking tea in a silence that wasn't awkward but wasn't fully comfortable either. Naomi stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked at my mom, and said, "Mrs. Lorraine, it's good to see you." My mother stood up and walked down the steps and hugged Naomi. Not a stiff, polite hug, a real one. And she said, I am so sorry. For all of it. You deserved better from this family, and you certainly deserved better from me. Naomi hugged her back and said, "Thank you. That was 3 months ago. My mother followed through. My father didn't reverse the will, so she filed for legal separation. My dad, the man who controlled everything, suddenly couldn't control the one person he'd taken for granted the longest. Paige told me he called her in a panic, asking her to talk sense into their mother. Paige said, 'She is making sense. You're the one who isn't.' Colton started coming over for dinner every other week. He and Naomi developed a friendship that mostly revolves around arguing about national parks and eating an unreasonable amount of tacos. Paige and I are rebuilding slowly. She's becoming the sister I always wished she'd been. She calls now. Real calls. She asks about Naomi. My mother comes to Sunday dinner at our house. She and Naomi cook together while I pretend to help, but mostly taste things. She's met Naomi's parents, and they get along beautifully. She's in therapy and finding herself for the first time at 63, and watching her discover who she is outside of my father's shadow has been unexpectedly beautiful. As for my dad, I haven't spoken to him. Paige says he's rattled but stubborn, which is the most accurate two-word description of Gerald I've ever heard. He's alone in that big house now, eating dinner by himself. I don't feel good about that, but I don't feel guilty either. He had a family. He had a son who loved him, and he traded all of it for control. The conference led to more speaking invitations. Naomi's pilot program launched last month, and the results are ahead of projections. We're talking about starting a family. Roosevelt is fat and happy and has claimed the left side of the couch as his personal kingdom. I think about that dinner sometimes. The folded paper, the blazer, Naomi's hand finding mine under the table while everything collapsed. And I think about what she whispered on our wedding night. You're not losing anything that was really yours. She was right. I didn't lose a thing. I just stopped holding on to what was never mine to begin with. And the moment I let go, everything I actually needed was already in my hands. So that's my story. If you're dealing with a family that treats their love like a transaction, I want you to know something. You are not the problem. You were never the problem. Build your own table. Fill it with people who show up because they want to, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. That's what I did, and I've never been happier.